The gold reached her ankles before Emily realized it wasn't water. It moved too heavily, clinging to her skin in thick, shimmering waves. Every step she took sent lazy ripples across the surface, each one catching the moonlight and throwing it back 100 times brighter. The air smelled like rain and metal, sharp, electric, alive. She stopped and looked down. Her reflection stared back at her from the glowing surface. Long dark hair plastered to her temples, wide hazel eyes, a thin white dress floating around her legs like mist. But the reflection wasn't quite right. Her skin glowed faintly, as if the light came from inside her, not from the lake. Behind her reflection, something else moved. Emily turned. Figures stood on the shore, half hidden in the shadows of the towering cliffs. They were human-shaped, but their faces were covered by masks of hammered gold that caught the moonlight, erasing their features. Their bare chests and arms were dusted in gold powder, every breath sending tiny particles drifting into the air like glittering smoke. They were watching her. A chill slid down her spine despite the warmth of the lake. She took a step back, and the gold climbed to her calves, thick and slow, as though it wanted to keep her. "Hello?" Her voice sounded small against the vastness of the mountains, swallowed by the echo of distant thunder. "Where am I?" No one answered. The lake stretched out around her like a bowl of liquid metal, framed by cliffs and jungle so dense that the outside world might not exist at all. Above, the sky was a dark velvet dome pierced by cold, unforgiving stars. Somewhere, an animal cried out, high, sharp, and quickly cut off. One of the masked figures stepped forward. He was taller than the others, broad-shouldered, with that effortless stillness of someone who wasn't afraid of anything. The gold dust on his skin seemed to glow brighter than the rest, turning him into a walking statue of light. In his right hand, he held a small disc of gold engraved with patterns Emily couldn't quite make out. He stopped at the edge of the lake. Even from a distance, she could feel the weight of his gaze behind the mask, the certainty of being seen. "Who are you?" she asked, voice unsteady. "What is this place?" The wind shifted. The air grew warmer, thicker, trembling with something just below the surface, like music you could feel but not hear. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, with an accent she couldn't place. "You crossed the water," he said. "You shouldn't be here." The gold at her legs pulsed. "I didn't cross anything," she protested. "I woke up here. I don't even know how I got—" The golden surface stirred. Light spiraled out from under her feet, curling around her like a living thing. For a heartbeat, she thought it would drag her under, but instead it climbed up her legs like a second skin, hugging every contour, shimmering with every breath she took. Panic flared in her chest. "This isn't real," she whispered. "It can't be real." The man tilted his head slightly as though disappointed. "Real enough," he said. "Real enough to change you." A breath of wind swept across the water, carrying with it a voice that wasn't his. A whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the lake, from the cliffs, from the sky. "El oro no es para quien lo mira," it murmured in Spanish, curling around her like smoke. "Es para quien lo guarda." The gold rose higher, now at her thighs. Emily's hands trembled. She tried to wade back toward the shore, but the lake resisted, thickening around her legs, refusing to let her go. "Please," she said, looking at the man. "Help me." He didn't move. "If you came to take," he said quietly, "the lake will swallow you. If you came to keep the secret, maybe it will let you breathe." "I didn't come for anything," her voice cracked. "I don't want your gold. I just want to know what this place is." He was silent for a long moment. The masked figures behind him shifted, gold dust glittering in the air. Somewhere deep below the surface, something massive moved, sending a slow, deliberate wave rolling toward her. He took one step closer to the water's edge. Even with the mask, she felt his eyes lock with hers. Felt something sharp and unsettling twist in her chest, like the beginning of recognition. "You will have to choose," he said softly. "The world, or this." The wave hit her. The gold surged up her body, hips, waist, ribs, chest. It was warm, almost gentle, but heavy enough to steal the air from her lungs. She tried to scream, but the light poured into her mouth, thick and bright, filling her, suffocating her. The last thing she saw before she went under was his face. For a split second, the mask wasn't there. She saw high cheekbones, a strong jaw, dark eyes lit from within by reflected gold. Eyes that looked at her not like a stranger, but like someone who'd been waiting a long time. Then the lake swallowed her whole. Light exploded behind her eyelids. She clawed her way up through it, lungs burning, heart racing, and woke up with a ragged gasp in the dark. The dorm room reassembled itself around her in pieces, the low hum of the mini fridge, the faint scent of burned microwave popcorn, the thin blanket tangled around her legs. A strip of light from the hallway slipped in under the door, cutting across the carpet like a pale blade. Her t-shirt was damp with sweat. Emily Carter pressed a shaking hand to her chest and stared at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sound of someone's music thumping from 3 floors below. For a moment, she could still feel it, the weight of the gold on her skin, the heat of it, the pressure of unseen eyes watching her from the shore. She turned her head and squinted at the cheap digital clock on the nightstand. 3:07 a.m. Of course. Nightmares always came at the ugliest hour. She lay there for a long moment, letting her breathing slow, tracing the cracks in the stained ceiling with her eyes. The dream had felt too real. The cold air, the smell of metal and rain, the way his voice had slid under her skin. "You will have to choose." She squeezed her eyes shut, then forced herself to sit up. "This is what I get for reading field reports at midnight," she muttered, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Her laptop sat on the desk across the room, still open. The glow of some article paused halfway down the page. Spanish colonial accounts, Muisca rituals, Lake Guatavita, El Dorado. She scrubbed her hands over her face and stood, the cheap mattress springs creaking in protest. Her reflection in the narrow mirror on the back of the door looked like she felt. Hair a mess, eyes tired, cheap cotton sleep shirt hanging off one shoulder. She leaned closer. For half a second, her brain lied to her. The light caught her skin in just the right way, and it almost looked like there was a faint shimmer of gold along her collarbones. Emily blinked, and it was gone. "Okay," she whispered to herself. "That's not creepy at all." She splashed water on her face in the tiny sink, pulled her hair into a messy bun, and crawled back into bed. Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and restless, full of half-remembered words in a language she didn't speak, and the weight of a stranger's dark eyes. By the time her alarm blared at 7:15, she felt like she'd run a marathon in her sleep. "Legend," Professor Harris said. The word snapped like a rubber band. "A myth. A narrative constructed by greedy conquistadors to justify their obsession with gold." The classroom lights were too bright. Emily's head pounded. She sat halfway back, notebook open, pen poised, trying to ignore the way 2 guys in the front row were whispering and glancing back at her like the lecture was background noise to whatever joke they were sharing. On the projector, a slide showed a painting. A king covered in gold dust, standing on a raft in the middle of a lake. El Dorado was never a place, Harris continued, pacing in front of the board. At best, it was a title, a person, the Gilded One. Over time, Europeans turned it into a city, then a kingdom, then a whole empire. Every explorer needed a map and a miracle. They had neither. He smiled at his own joke. A few students laughed. Emily's pen pressed harder into the paper. Her notebook margin was already filled with tiny notes. Muisca Ritual Lake. Possible misinterpretation. Spanish chronicler 1539. Exaggerated? Why same coordinates repeated? Her heart thudded faster. Any questions? Harris asked, scanning the room. Her hand went up before she could talk herself out of it. He hesitated a fraction of a second before nodding. Yes, Ms. Carter. Every head turned. She felt their eyes on her, not the way she wanted. Not she's smart, but, oh, the pretty one is talking. Actually, Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady, I was reading some translated field notes last night. There's more than one account of a ritual involving a gold-covered chief on a raft. Not just from the Spanish, but local oral histories recorded later. And the location descriptions are consistent. Some exaggerations are consistent, Harris replied lightly. But what if they weren't all exaggerations? She pushed. What if the legend started from something real? A real lake, a real ritual, maybe even a real settlement nearby. Not a whole golden city, but Ms. Carter. The smile on his face didn't reach his eyes. We've all seen the documentaries. The History Channel may love the idea of a secret city in the jungle, but peer-reviewed archaeology requires more than enthusiasm and cable specials. A few people snickered. Heat rushed to her face. Emily's fingers tightened around her pen. I wasn't talking about documentaries, she said quieter. I was talking about primary sources. He waved a hand, already turning away. I'm sure your curiosity will make for an excellent final paper. For now, let's move on to the Inca road system, much more real and far better documented. The class shifted, laptops clicked, conversations died down. Emily stared at her notebook. On the page, under her meticulous notes, her hand had moved on its own, sketching something without her permission. A circle, lines radiating outward, and beneath it a lake that looked suspiciously like molten metal. Her stomach dipped. When did I see that? Her mind flashed back to the dream, the disc of gold in the man's hand, the engraved pattern she couldn't quite decipher, the way it had gleamed at the water's edge. She closed the notebook slowly. No one in that room believed in El Dorado. Not really. To them, it was entertainment. Something to mention in a lecture before getting back to serious topics. They saw her interest as cute at best, naive at worst. They saw her. They just didn't see her. Emily glanced out the window, toward the strip of winter-pale sky visible above the campus buildings. For a split second, the glare of sunlight on a distant car windshield looked like something else, like a flash of gold on a dark lake. She blinked, and it was gone. But the whisper from her dream lingered in the back of her mind like a promise. You will have to choose. Between what and what, she didn't know yet. But as the professor's voice blurred into background noise, Emily Carter knew one thing with a certainty that settled in her bones. Legend or not, El Dorado wasn't done with her. Emily's shift at the campus cafe started 20 minutes after class. By then, she'd replayed the moment with Professor Harris so many times it felt like a bruise on her brain. In every mental replay, she came up with the perfect quote, the perfect citation, the perfect line that shut him up and made the whole class stare at her, like she was more than a pretty extra in the background. In reality, she tied on a stained black apron and started making vanilla lattes for people who didn't even look up from their phones. Name? She asked the guy in front of her. Jake, he said, thumb still scrolling. Of course. Steam hissed, milk frothed, cups clattered on the counter. Her body moved on autopilot. Her mind stayed on a dark lake that glowed like metal, a masked stranger on the shore, and the impossible weight of gold crawling up her legs. During a lull, she slipped her phone from her pocket and reopened the article she'd been reading at 3:07 a.m. The grainy photo of a mountain lake filled the screen, flat, dark, unimpressive. To anyone else, it looked like cold water. To her, it looked like a door. "Carter." Her coworker snapped his fingers. "You with us?" She flinched and stuffed the phone away. "Yeah, sorry." By the time her shift ended, the winter sun was already bleeding out behind the campus library. Emily cut across the quad with her hands shoved deep in her coat pockets, her breath fogging the air. The red brick buildings and white columns looked exactly like the glossy brochure that had convinced her this place was the answer to everything. Tonight, they just looked small, like a stage set someone could fold up and carry away. Her dorm room was empty when she opened the door. One roommate was at a party. The other practically lived at her boyfriend's apartment. The quiet hummed around her as the heater kicked on, blowing lukewarm air that smelled faintly of dust. The smart thing would be to let it go. She could write a safe paper about colonial myths and European greed, plug in all the right citations, and collect a solid grade. She could pretend El Dorado was just a story with good branding. Pretend the dream meant nothing. Pretend she hadn't felt that lake on her skin. Instead, she went to her little bookshelf and pulled down the oldest book she owned. It was a translated collection of early Spanish chronicles, the kind of thing everyone else hunted as a PDF, but she liked in her hands. Thin yellowed pages, cracked spine, ink that had seeped slightly through the paper. She'd checked it out so many times the librarian just slid it to her now without even looking at her ID. When she opened it, something slipped from the middle and fell to the carpet with a soft thud. Emily frowned and bent to pick it up. It was a small notebook, palm-sized, bound in dark leather, polished by decades of handling. No library sticker, no call number, no barcode. On the back cover, 3 faint gold letters had been pressed into the leather. J.E.K. "Where did you come from?" she murmured. She sat on the edge of her bed and opened it carefully. The first page was filled with tight, slanted handwriting in English, the ink gone brown with age. June 14th, 1923. Reached the plateau at last. The guide refuses to go farther. He calls the lake by a name I cannot pronounce and will not repeat it. The men grow nervous when the drums begin at night. A little electric shiver ran through her. She turned the page. The entries fell into a rhythm. Complaints about heat and insects and altitude. Arguments with guides. Maps that didn't match the actual ground. Then, slowly, the tone shifted. July 2nd. Heard drums again at dusk. Not echo, not wind. Too regular. It feels like the mountain is breathing. July 10th. Found offerings near a high lake. Gold dust in the mud. Broken pottery. Small figures. The guide will not look at the water. He says those who stare too long are remembered. On the next page, a sketch took up most of the space. A circular lake, ringed by steep slopes. In the center, a tiny figure stood on a raft, drawn with a few sure lines. Radiating from it were straight strokes like rays of light. Beside it, 3 words were written in a smaller hand. He was made gold. Emily's fingers tightened on the notebook. Her pulse thudded in her throat as she flipped forward. July 11th. The stories were not entirely lies. It is not a city of gold as imagined in Europe. No streets paved with treasure. But there is a secret here that is worse for them and better for those who keep it. They guard it fiercely. They call it by many names. I shall borrow the one word that terrifies the men who sent us. El Dorado. She swallowed. This notebook should have been catalogued, scanned, dissected in articles written by people with framed degrees and professional headshots. Instead, it had been left inside a forgotten book, waiting for someone obsessive or foolish enough to find it. Or for the right person, that inner voice whispered again. She turned to the last entry. The handwriting had grown shakier. July 18th. They do not wish to be found. My guide left in the night without his pay. At the water's edge, I felt eyes on me, though I stood alone. It was not God's judgment I feared, but something older. If I speak, I betray them. If I am silent, I betray my work. Never have I stood so close to history and been less certain I had the right to touch it. At the very bottom, almost crammed into the margin, they are still here, somewhere, waiting for the wrong person or the right one. The heater hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed. A girl laughed, sharp and distant. None of it felt quite real. Emily flipped back to the sketch of the lake. Up close, the rays around the figure weren't random after all. They formed a circle with tiny notches, like a sun disk, the same shape the man in her dream had held in his hand when he stood at the shore and told her she would have to choose. Her mouth went dry. She set the notebook gently on the bed, opened her laptop on the desk, and pulled up a map. The last page of the notebook had a scrap of paper tucked into it, brittle and yellowed, covered in numbers and abbreviations. Old coordinates. It took her a couple of minutes to translate them into the format the map site understood. The satellite image took its time loading, grid squares dropping into place one by one. Mountains, valleys, green, more green. Then there it was. A dark, perfectly round spot, high in the spine of the continent. No roads traced their way toward it. No neatly labeled towns hugged its shore. On the map, it wasn't anything special. Just an unnamed lake, a blue dot in a field of green. To her, it was a heartbeat. She zoomed in until the image blurred into pixels, then out again. Checked the nearest city, the nearest airport, the altitude, the scale. Her banking app sat on her phone, innocent and merciless. She checked it anyway. The number in her checking account was exactly what she expected. Enough for rent, groceries, a cushion so thin it barely deserved the word. Her savings were almost laughable. Her credit card balance made her stomach tighten. People did not empty their lives into a plane ticket because of a dream and a notebook they weren't supposed to find. People who wanted safe, predictable lives didn't. She thought of Professor Harris's polite little smile, of the way her classmates had turned to look at her, not because of what she'd said, but because of how she looked saying it, of how quickly the room had moved on the second a man started talking again. She thought of the masked stranger at the Golden Lake, his voice low and certain. "You will have to choose." "Okay," she said aloud, to the empty room and the humming heater and the nameless dark lake on her screen. "So I choose." She pulled up the cafe's online schedule and grabbed every open shift she could. She made a list in the Notes app on her phone. Sell old camera, return the shoes she couldn't really afford, dip into the emergency fund she'd been building since she was 16 and too scared to even buy movie theater popcorn. She opened a budget airline site and typed in dates, cities, anything that got her inside the same country as that dot on the map without breaking the universe. Her fingers shook when she reached the payment page. She stopped long enough to take a breath, then another. The fear didn't disappear, but it stopped telling her what to do. She entered her card number and hit purchase. A cheerful confirmation email dropped into her inbox a second later, all exclamation points in fine print, completely unaware that it had just split her life into before and after. Departure. In 2 weeks. Destination. A city whose name she'd only ever seen on screens. A bus ride away from mountains that had watched centuries of people come and go. She printed the itinerary and slid it into the back of the notebook, behind the last entry. The paper looked strangely new against the brown pages. They are still here, somewhere, waiting for the wrong person, or the right one. Her thumb traced the last 3 words. Far away, across an ocean and a language and 100 small fears, a lonely little lake slept under a blanket of cloud. Emily had the sudden, unnerving sense that whatever waited on its shore already knew she was coming, and had been waiting a very long time. Emily had imagined her first steps in South America would feel triumphant, like crossing a threshold only the bold ever dared. Instead, they felt like a punch to the lungs. The airport sat in a high-altitude city cupped between mountains so tall they looked unreal, their peaks biting into clouds. The air was thin, crisp, and carried the scent of diesel, grilled corn, and cold stone. Emily dragged her backpack through the arrivals exit, her nerves buzzing like exposed wires. Buses honked. Taxi drivers shouted for passengers. Women sold empanadas from metal trays that steamed in the cool morning air. Someone played a pan flute nearby, the bright notes slipping through the chaos. She checked the notebook one more time. Coordinates. Notes. A lake that didn't appear on tourist maps. A journey that all common sense insisted she shouldn't be on. But here she was. Her first days were an exhausting blur of wrong roads and half-translated conversations. Emily's Spanish was passable in a classroom sense, but fell apart under real pressure. She learned quickly that muy alto could mean very tall, very steep, or you're absolutely going the wrong way. She took crowded buses up mountain passes that curved like snakes, stayed in hostels where the walls were thin and the showers colder than glacial melt, and walked until her legs trembled. Every local she asked about the lake reacted the same way. A tight look, a shift of the eyes, a muttered no say. But silence was still an answer. Silence meant they knew something. On the fourth day, while crossing a small marketplace in a mountain village, she stopped at a stall selling herbs and hand-carved talismans. The vendor, an elderly man with skin weathered like dried earth, spoke quietly as she pointed to a drawing of a sun disk similar to the one in her notebook. "You shouldn't follow that," he said in Spanish, voice low. "The people near that lake, they hide more than gold." Her heart leaped. "Where is it?" she asked. He hesitated, then pointed with the edge of his chin toward a ridge high above the village. "There," he whispered, "but you shouldn't go alone." "I'm not alone," she said. He studied her for a long moment. His gaze softened, as though he saw the exhaustion, the stubborn fire, the ache beneath her determination. "You don't have the eyes of someone who leaves once they find what they're looking for," he murmured. "Be careful, Nina." Emily swallowed. Later, she would realize he wasn't warning her about danger. He was warning her about destiny. By the 6th day, she was running dangerously low on money and dangerously high on determination. The mountain trail cut through thick cloud cover, pine needles slick beneath her boots. Her backpack felt heavier with each step, though she had eaten almost all the food she'd packed. She was halfway up the ridge when the sky darkened. Thunder murmured in the distance. Cold mist curled around her as if the mountain were exhaling directly onto her skin. "Perfect," she muttered, pulling her hood tighter. The trail narrowed. Her foot slid on wet stone. Then a voice behind her said, calm and clear, "You shouldn't be up here." Emily spun so fast she nearly lost her footing. A man stood 10 feet away, young, tall, broad shoulders, dark hair, wind-tossed and heavy with mist. His skin was sun-warm bronze, his jaw strong, his cheekbones sharp. He wore worn hiking boots, dark pants, and a weatherproof jacket that looked too clean for someone who'd climbed this far. But it was his eyes that held her in place. Deep brown, almost black, steady as mountain roots. Handsome didn't begin to cover it. He looked like someone carved out of quiet strength. "Who are you?" she demanded, pulse leaping. He stepped closer, boots silent on the damp earth. "My name is Ari," he said. His accent was local, warm around the vowels. "You're lost." Emily bristled. "I'm not lost." He lifted an eyebrow. "Then why are you walking directly into a storm? Alone? On a trail even locals don't climb without a reason." "I have a reason." He looked at her backpack, at the map tube sticking out of it, at the notebook sticking from the side pocket. "Yes," he said softly. "I can see that." "That's not an answer," she shot back. "No," he agreed. but it's true. A cold wind whipped between them. She shivered. "Where are you going?" Ari asked. She hesitated, then said the words anyway. "I'm looking for a lake." Something flickered in his expression. Not surprise, not fear. Something heavier. Recognition. "Many lakes here," he murmured. "Not like this one." She pulled the notebook from her bag and held it out. Ari's gaze dropped to the worn leather. His breath caught, barely, but enough for her to notice. He didn't take it. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly. "Why does it matter?" "Because that is not a notebook meant for tourists." Emily gripped it tighter. "I'm not a tourist." Ari studied her, really looked at her, as though weighing truths she hadn't spoken. The storm clouds pressed lower. The first cold raindrops splattered the ground. "You won't reach the lake before nightfall," he said. "The storm will break soon. You need shelter." "I can keep going." "No," he said simply. The wind swirled. Mist curled around their legs. "Come with me," he added. Emily stiffened. "To where?" "To somewhere safe," he said. "And dry." "I don't know you." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You are brave to be here at all, but bravery is not the same as wisdom." His eyes softened. "If I meant you harm, I wouldn't warn you." He turned as though expecting her to follow. For a moment she debated turning back, storm or not, but her gut, the same one that had pushed her across an ocean, whispered that this man was not a danger. He was a turning point. She followed. The path Ari chose wound down the ridge, curving under an overhang of stone where the rain couldn't reach. A small wooden shelter stood tucked against the cliff face, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Inside was a small fire pit, blankets, and a bench made of carved wood. Who built this? She wondered. They sat across from one another, the storm raging outside like a living thing. Ari lit a small fire with practiced ease. Orange light flickered across his face, highlighting his jaw, the slope of his nose, the intensity in his eyes. Emily pulled her knees to her chest and watched him. "You were heading to the lake," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. "Why?" She swallowed. "Because I think there's something there. Something that was never really lost. Something people just stopped believing existed. Most things stay hidden because they must," he said quietly. "You know about it, don't you?" She pressed. "The lake, the rituals, the gold." His expression didn't change, but the fire reflected in his eyes like golden sparks. "You shouldn't say those things aloud in these mountains," he murmured. "Names have power. Stories, too." Emily leaned forward. "If you know something, please, tell me." Silence. Only the storm answered. A long minute passed. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small object. When he placed it on the bench between them, her breath caught. A sun disk, almost identical to the one sketched in her notebook. "You've seen this before," Ari said. Her throat tightened. "Only in a dream." His gaze sharpened. "Dreams can be warnings. Or invitations," she whispered. Their eyes locked. Something electric passed between them. Recognition, familiarity, something neither could name yet. Ari broke the gaze first. "What you seek cannot be found by accident," he said. "Not by maps or coordinates, only by invitation." Emily trembled. "Invitation from who?" "The lake," he said, "or those who guard it." She exhaled shakily. "Is that you?" He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. Hours later, the storm eased. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Ari stood and offered her a hand. "Come," he said. "There is something you must see." She hesitated only a heartbeat before taking it, They walked deeper into the forest, the ground soft beneath their steps, the sky clearing to reveal sharp stars. After half an hour, the trees parted and the mountain dropped away into a vast high valley cradled between jagged peaks. In the center of the valley lay a lake, dark, perfectly round, silent as if holding its breath. Emily's own breath caught. From this distance it looked ordinary, but something inside her stirred, a sensation like déjà vu in her bones. "It's not the lake," Ari said, watching her face. "Not the true one. But the path begins here." "What path?" she whispered. Ari stepped closer, so close she could feel the warmth of him, even in the cold mountain air. "The one only a few are allowed to walk," he said softly. "And I think you were meant to." Her heart thundered. "So you'll show me?" she asked. His gaze held hers, dark, deep, steady. "Yes," Ari said, "but once you see it, your life will never belong only to you again." Emily looked back at the lake, at the mountains, at the man whose presence felt like fate in human form. "I'm not afraid," she said. Ari's faint smile returned, this time touched with something reverent, almost relieved. "Then come," he murmured. "El Dorado is waiting." The road back to the United States felt longer than the journey out had ever been. Emily watched mountains shrink into clouds, watched the continent fall away beneath the airplane window like a dream dissolving at sunrise. But even 30,000 feet in the air, she could still feel the echo of the valley, the press of ancient silence, the warmth of Ari's hand pulling her across the shimmering boundary into a world that shouldn't exist. El Dorado wasn't gold, not truly. It was light, life, a quiet, sacred heartbeat beneath the surface of the world. And she had walked its streets. She had seen homes carved into shimmering stone, gardens irrigated by channels of water that glittered as if carrying liquid sunlight. She had seen elders whose eyes held centuries of memory. She had touched walls that vibrated with warmth, not from the sun, but from something deeper. She had felt Ari's steady presence beside her, grounding her, guiding her through places he'd been raised to protect. When she asked how the city remained hidden, he had simply said, "Because we choose to be forgotten." Now, hurtling back toward the life she'd stepped out of, she understood why the elders insisted she leave before she decided anything. No one could stand inside a miracle and see clearly. Distance was supposed to make the choice easier. It didn't. Campus felt smaller when she returned, and colder. The same students filled the quad, rushing to classes, laughing too loudly, shoulders hunched under winter coats. Nothing had changed, except her. She walked into Professor Harris's classroom on the first morning back. "Ms. Carter," he said, offering that polite, almost condescending smile. "I assume your break was productive?" She stood straighter than she ever had in front of him. "Yes," she said. "Very." He waited for elaboration. When none came, he nodded and moved on. The lecture blurred around her. In a notebook full of half-finished thoughts, she wrote only one sentence. "They will never see me." Her phone buzzed. A friend from class. "Are we meeting for group study later?" Then another. "Did you hear about the internship?" Then, "Party tonight. You're coming, right?" She stared at the messages, answered none. On the walk home, she caught her reflection in a window. Hair wind-tossed, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes darker than she remembered. For one disorienting moment, she imagined gold dust shimmering along her collarbones, catching light that wasn't there. She blinked. It vanished. But the ache in her chest didn't. That night she opened the notebook, the one she'd found hidden inside the library book, now filled with new sketches she didn't remember drawing. Curving patterns, lines radiating outward. A circular lake, always a circular lake. At the very back, Tucked between the cover and the last page was something she had never placed there. A slip of parchment. Thin. Worn. Inked in Ari's handwriting. When you are ready, follow the silence. Her breath caught. He had known she wouldn't be able to forget. She pressed the paper to her chest, squeezing her eyes shut. El Dorado hadn't been a discovery. It had been a summons. The next day she tried something reckless. She told the truth. Not all of it. That would have been impossible, but she tried. To a professor she respected, to a classmate she'd once trusted, to the girl who sat 3 seats down and always borrowed her notes. I found something over break, she said carefully. A place, a lake, something that... I don't know how to explain it, but That sounds intense, the classmate said, smiling politely. Are you okay? You look tired. The professor chuckled. Mythic landscapes tend to do that. Dreams can feel real when we want them to. The girl with her notes nodded sympathetically. Maybe write about it. Could make a cool creative project. Her words landed lightly, harmlessly. But to Emily, they hit like gravel thrown against glass. No one believed her. Worse, no one even considered it. She could scream the truth in the middle of the quad, and the world would smile, pat her shoulder, and keep walking. She was still the same thing she'd always been to them, a pretty girl with interesting obsessions and no real impact, invisible in the ways that mattered. Her chest tightened. That night, she made tea, sat at her desk, and stared at the golden disc sketch she'd drawn a dozen times. The notebook lay open in front of her, the slip of parchment burning against her skin. Follow the silence. She didn't sleep. She had already chosen. 2 days later, she was back in South America. Half her bank account was gone. Her credit card was now something future Emily would have to cry over. None of it mattered. The mountains greeted her like old friends. The altitude stung her lungs, waking something in her veins she'd forgotten she needed. She took the same buses, the same roads, walked the same dusty paths, but this time, her steps were sure. As she climbed the ridge, the wind whispered through the trees, twisting her hair across her cheeks. The sky darkened, just as it had the day she'd almost turned back, almost given up. She reached the clearing. The valley opened before her like a held breath. And there, standing at the edge of the trail, as though he had always known she would return, was Ari. He didn't look surprised. He didn't smile. But the relief in his eyes was unmistakable. You came back, he said quietly. Emily set her pack down, her voice steady. You knew I would. Ari stepped closer, the familiar gravity of his presence pulling her in. The world didn't believe you. It never has. Does that hurt? Yes, she admitted, but it also made the choice easier. He reached toward her, hesitated for half a second, then brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His fingers were warm, rough from rope and weather, and secret work she still didn't understand. You left a world that never saw you for one that isn't meant to be found, he murmured. That is not a small choice. It wasn't difficult, she whispered. Not after seeing what's real. Ari's expression shifted. A quiet storm of pride, tenderness, and something deeper. Something ancient. Then come, he said. The path will open for you now. He took her hand. The mountains around them grew still, as though bowing. They walked down into the valley, past the circle of stones, past the moss-covered archway, past the boundary where the air grew warmer and more charged. The lake appeared before them, smooth as a mirror, reflecting a sun that had not yet risen. Ari stepped into the water. Are you afraid? He asked. Emily looked at the golden surface, at the place where reality bent and secrets lived. "No," she said. She stepped in beside him. The water glowed beneath their feet, light curling upward like a living thing. It rose to her calves, warm this time, welcoming. Then her knees, her waist, her ribs. Ari squeezed her hand. The world brightened, then broke open. Light exploded across the lake's surface, pulling away, drawing back like a curtain. And beyond it, rising in impossible symmetry from the water and stone, lay the hidden city. El Dorado. Alive, breathing, waiting. Emily exhaled shakily, emotion crashing through her like a wave. "It's more beautiful than I remembered." "That's because you're seeing it clearly now," Ari said softly, without fear, without doubt. She looked at him, at the man who had stepped out of a dream and into her life, at the secret he carried like a promise, at the choice she had made freely, finally, fully. "What happens now?" she asked. Ari lifted her hand to his lips. The touch was feather-light, reverent. "Now," he said, "you come home." The golden light embraced them both. The city shimmered before them, its towers gleaming like captured sunlight. Emily stepped forward and didn't look back.